When I was 12 years old, I discovered something in the woods behind my grandmother's house that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It wasn't supposed to be there. Nothing like that should exist in nature. But it did exist, and it was waiting. I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about what I saw that summer. The smell of rotting vegetation mixed with something else, something metallic and wrong. The way the water moved even when there was no wind, the sounds that came from beneath the surface after midnight. You see, everyone in our small town knew about Miller's Pond. Parents warned their children to stay away from it. The local sheriff posted signs around the perimeter. Even the teenagers who dared each other to do stupid things avoided that place after dark. But nobody ever explained why. I was different back then. Curious to a fault. The kind of kid who couldn't leave a mystery unsolved. So when my grandmother mentioned the pond during one of her rambling stories about the old days, I knew I had to see it for myself. She'd grown up in that house, lived there her whole life, and she'd never once set foot near those murky waters. That should have been my first warning. The morning I decided to investigate, the summer heat was already oppressive by 9 o'clock. Cicadas buzzed in the trees, creating a constant drone that seemed to vibrate through my bones. My grandmother was busy in her garden, completely absorbed in her tomatoes and completely unaware that I was about to make the biggest mistake of my young life. I grabbed an old fishing rod from the garage, partly as an excuse, and partly because I thought it might be useful. The path through the woods was overgrown, barely visible beneath the tangle of brambles and fallen branches. It took me nearly 30 minutes to push through the undergrowth, following what might have once been a trail. And then I saw it. Miller's Pond stretched out before me like a dark mirror, perfectly circular and surrounded by dead trees. The water was so still it looked like black glass. Not a single ripple disturbed the surface. No insects skimmed across it. No birds flew overhead. Even the ever-present buzz of mosquitoes seemed muffled here. The silence was absolute. I stood at the edge, staring into water so dark I couldn't see the bottom. The trees around the pond were leafless, despite the summer heat, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Moss hung from them in long gray strands that barely moved in the stagnant air. Everything about this place felt wrong. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees the moment I stepped into the clearing. My skin prickled with goosebumps, despite the sweat still beading on my forehead from the hike. The air itself seemed thicker here, harder to breathe. But I was 12, and 12-year-olds don't always listen to their instincts. I cast my line into the center of the pond, watching the red and white bobber disappear beneath the surface without so much as a splash. The water seemed to swallow it eagerly, hungrily. I waited, counting the seconds, expecting to feel the familiar tug of a fish on the line. Instead, I felt something else entirely. The fishing rod began to vibrate in my hands. Not the gentle pull of a fish, but a violent trembling that traveled up through the line and into the rod itself. My knuckles went white as I gripped it tighter, trying to maintain control. The vibration intensified, becoming so violent that my teeth began to chatter. Then the pond started to change. The perfectly still surface began to bubble, small at first, just a few tiny disturbances near the center, where my line disappeared into the depths. But the bubbling spread outward in concentric circles, growing larger and more violent with each passing second. The water turned from black to a sickly green, then to something that looked almost red in the fading afternoon light. I should have dropped the rod and run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get away from that place. But something held me there, rooted to the muddy shore. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, or maybe something in that pond wanted me to stay. The bubbling intensified until the entire surface of the pond was churning like a cauldron. And then I heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd ever experienced before or since. It started as a low rumble, barely audible above the churning water, but it grew louder, deeper, more resonant. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet and echoing off the dead trees surrounding the pond. It wasn't quite a roar. It wasn't quite a scream. It was something far more primal, more ancient, the kind of sound that reaches into your DNA and awakens fears you didn't know you carried. My fishing rod snapped. The sudden release sent me stumbling backward, landing hard on the muddy ground. The broken rod clattered beside me as I watched my fishing line disappear into the roiling water. The sound grew louder, more demanding. The very air seemed to pulse with each resonant note. And then, through the churning green and red water, I saw something rise. Not a fish. Not anything that belonged in any pond, no matter how strange. What I saw defied every natural law I thought I understood. It was massive, easily the size of a car, but it moved with a fluid grace that no earthly creature could possess. The water around it didn't splash or spray as it surfaced. Instead, it seemed to part reverently, as if acknowledging the presence of something ancient and terrible. The thing had no definable shape. It seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow given form, but I could make out what might have been eyes. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They glowed with a sickly yellow light that cut through the murky water like searchlights scanning for prey. Every single one of them was looking directly at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat had closed completely, paralyzed by a terror so complete it shut down my basic bodily functions. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink as those countless eyes studied me with what felt like malevolent intelligence. The creature rose higher, revealing more of its impossible form. Tentacles or appendages writhed beneath the surface, each one thick as a tree trunk. The water around it began to glow with the same sickly yellow light as its eyes, casting everything in an otherworldly illumination that made my skin look corpse pale. Then it spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind. The voice was ancient beyond measure, carrying with it the weight of centuries. It spoke of hunger that had lasted since before humans walked the earth, of patience that could wait decades for the right moment, of a thirst that could never be satisfied no matter how much it consumed. And it spoke of recognition. It knew me, had been waiting for me, had been calling to me through dreams I couldn't remember, drawing me to this place through a compulsion I'd mistaken for curiosity. Every step I'd taken into these woods had been guided by its will, not my own. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This thing had been planning this encounter since before I was born. Maybe since before my grandmother was born. It had patience beyond human comprehension, and it had chosen me for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. The creature began to sink back beneath the surface, but its eyes never left mine. As it disappeared into the depths, the water gradually returned to its mirror-like stillness. The oppressive silence descended again, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. But just before it vanished completely, the thing in the pond showed me something that would change everything. I thought I knew about my family, my town, and the true nature of the evil that lived in those dark waters. I saw my grandmother, not as she was now, elderly and frail, tending her garden in the morning sun. I saw her as a young woman, maybe 20 years old, standing at the very spot where I now sat frozen in terror. She was holding the hand of a small child, a little girl with pigtails and a sundress that looked like it belonged to another era entirely. The vision lasted only seconds, but every detail burned itself into my memory with crystal clarity. My grandmother's face was streaked with tears, her mouth moving in what looked like an apology. The little girl beside her seemed calm, almost peaceful, as if she understood something that the adult world had hidden from her. Then both figures began walking toward the pond. The vision ended abruptly, leaving me gasping on the muddy shore. My hands shook as I wiped dirt and dead leaves from my clothes. The creature was gone. The pond had returned to its unnatural stillness, but the message was clear. This thing had a history with my family that went back generations. I stumbled through the woods in a daze, branches tearing at my shirt and brambles cutting my arms. The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned as I put distance between myself and that cursed place. Birds chirped tentatively. Insects buzzed. The temperature rose back to its oppressive summer heat. But I could still feel those eyes watching me, even after the pond was far behind. When I finally emerged from the woods, my grandmother was waiting on the back porch. She took one look at my muddy clothes and scratched arms, and her face went pale for a moment. Neither of us spoke. Then she grabbed my shoulders with surprising strength for someone her age. Her voice was barely a whisper when she finally found words. She asked me where I'd been, though we both knew she already had the answer. I tried to lie, to make up some story about exploring the creek or chasing rabbits, but the words died in my throat. Something in her eyes told me that lies wouldn't work here, so I told her everything about the fishing rod and the bubbling water and the sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, about the creature with its countless glowing eyes and the way it had spoken directly into my mind, and most importantly, about the vision it had shown me. My grandmother listened without interruption, her grip on my shoulders tightening with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she led me inside and sat me down at her kitchen table. She made tea with hands that trembled slightly, a detail I'd never noticed before. The story she told me that afternoon changed everything I thought I knew about our family history. Her younger sister had disappeared when my grandmother was 19 years old. Emma was her name, and she'd been only 7 when it happened. The official story was that she'd wandered off into the woods and gotten lost. Search parties combed the forest for weeks, but never found so much as a piece of her clothing. But my grandmother knew better. She'd seen Emma talking to something in the pond during the weeks before she vanished. Not to another person, but to the water itself. Emma would sit at the edge for hours, having what looked like conversations with empty air. When asked about it, she'd just smile and say she was talking to her new friend who lived underwater. The night Emma disappeared, my grandmother had followed her to Miller's Pond. She'd watched her sister walk straight into that black water, without hesitation, without fear, as if she were simply going home. The water had accepted her eagerly, closing over her head without so much as a ripple. And my grandmother had done nothing to stop it. She'd been paralyzed by the same terror that had frozen me earlier that day. The same presence that had shown me visions had whispered promises to her all those decades ago. Promises about Emma being safe and happy in a world beneath the water. Promises that if she stayed quiet, if she never told anyone what she'd really seen, then no one else would have to suffer the same fate. But promises made by things that lurk in dark waters are never what they seem. Over the years, other children had vanished near Miller's Pond. Not many, and not often enough to establish a clear pattern. Maybe one every 5 or 10 years. Always children who'd been seen talking to themselves near the water. Always children who walked into those depths willingly, as if answering a call that only they could hear. My grandmother had kept her silence through all of it, honoring an agreement made in terror and grief when she was barely more than a child herself. She'd married, had children of her own, and moved away from the area for decades. But when her husband died, she'd returned to the old family house, and the thing in the pond had been waiting for her. It never tried to take her. She was too old, too aware of its true nature, but it made its presence known in other ways. Ripples in her well water when there should have been none, shadows moving beneath the surface of her bird bath, dreams that felt more like memories, showing her Emma playing in underwater gardens that couldn't possibly exist. The creature was patient. It could wait decades between feedings, but it was also persistent. It had been calling to the children in our family for generations, drawing them back to that pond when the time was right. My grandmother had thought she'd broken the cycle by moving away, by having children who grew up far from Miller's Pond. But bloodlines run deep, and some hungers are older than human memory. I was the first of the next generation to hear its call, the first to feel that inexplicable pull toward the dark water. And according to my grandmother, I wouldn't be the last. My younger cousins would feel it too. Eventually. The thing in the pond had marked our family long ago, and it collected its due with the patience of something that had existed since before recorded history. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything I'd learned. Every creak of the old house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to writhe with hidden movement. But worst of all was the growing certainty that this wasn't over. The creature had shown itself to me for a reason. It had revealed my grandmother's secret not out of malice, but as a kind of introduction, a way of saying that we knew each other now, that we were connected by something deeper than mere chance encounter. And somewhere in the back of my mind I could still hear its voice, not the words it had spoken by the pond, but something else. Something that sounded almost like singing a lullaby made of water and darkness, calling me back to where I belonged. I belonged. I fought that pull for 3 days. 3 days of pacing my grandmother's house like a caged animal, jumping at every sound, avoiding windows that faced the woods. My grandmother watched me with growing concern, recognizing the signs she'd probably seen in Emma all those years ago. The singing in my head grew louder each night. What had started as a barely audible whisper became a constant chorus that drowned out normal thoughts. I'd catch myself walking toward the back door without remembering the decision to move. My feet would carry me to the edge of the porch before I'd snap back to awareness, heart pounding, hands shaking. On the 4th morning, I woke up with mud between my toes. I hadn't remembered leaving my bed, hadn't remembered walking through the house or opening the back door. But there I was, standing in my pajamas on the dewy grass, facing the tree line where the path to Miller's Pond began. The mud was still wet, still cold against my skin. I'd been sleepwalking, or something had been walking me. My grandmother found me there 20 minutes later, still frozen in place, staring at the woods with an expression she recognized all too well. She didn't say anything at first, just wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and guided me back inside. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the same helpless terror she'd carried for decades. That afternoon, she tried to convince my parents to take me home early, made up some story about needing to visit a sick friend in the city. But my mother had been looking forward to this visit for months, had taken time off work specifically to spend with her mother-in-law. She brushed off the suggestion with a laugh, saying I was probably just going through a phase. Adults never listen when it matters most. That night, my grandmother sat vigil outside my bedroom door. I could hear her rocking chair creaking in the hallway, the soft rustle of pages as she pretended to read. But I knew she was really listening for the sound of my feet hitting the floor, watching for any sign that I might try to wander again. Her precautions didn't matter. The thing in the pond didn't need me to walk anywhere. I dreamed that the water came to me instead. In the dream, black liquid seeped up through the floorboards of my grandmother's house. It moved with purpose, flowing around furniture legs and pooling in the corners of rooms. The smell was overwhelming. That same mixture of decay and metal I'd encountered at the pond, but worse now, concentrated and inescapable in the confined space. The water rose steadily, inch by inch, until it reached the level of my bed. Then it began to whisper. Not with the ancient voice I'd heard before, but with Emma's voice, sweet and young and perfectly preserved after all these decades underwater. She told me about the world beneath Miller's Pond, about cities of coral and bone that stretched for miles in every direction, about gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in the eternal darkness, their petals glowing with the same sickly light as the creature's eyes, about playmates who never aged, never grew tired, never wanted to leave their perfect underwater paradise. It sounded wonderful in the dream. A place where children could be children forever, where the harsh realities of the adult world never intruded. Emma's voice painted pictures of endless games and endless laughter, of friends who understood each other without words. But even in the dream, some part of me remembered what I'd actually seen in that vision by the pond, the tears on my grandmother's face, the resignation in Emma's eyes, the way the water had claimed her without ceremony or celebration. The paradise Emma described was a lie wrapped in truth. There might indeed be wonders beneath that dark surface, but they came at a price that couldn't be undone. I woke up screaming. My grandmother burst through the door before the sound had fully left my throat. She found me sitting upright in bed, sheets soaked with sweat, pointing at puddles of water that covered the hardwood floor. Water that shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there, but was undeniably real. She didn't ask questions, just grabbed towels from the linen closet and began mopping up the impossible flood, while I sat shivering and trying to convince myself it had only been a dream. But the smell lingered, that metallic organic stench that seemed to cling to everything it touched. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. My cousin Sarah, who lived 2 towns over, had gone missing during the night, 8 years old, blonde pigtails, last seen in her backyard around sunset. The police were organizing search parties. Family members were driving in from across the state. My grandmother's face went gray when she heard the news. She knew, just as I knew, that no search party would find Sarah. Not alive, anyway. The thing in Miller's Pond had grown tired of waiting for me to come willingly. It had decided to collect what it was owed from another branch of the family tree. But something had changed in me during that waterlogged nightmare. The constant singing in my head had stopped. The compulsive pull toward the woods had faded to a manageable whisper. It was as if the creature's attention had shifted, releasing its hold on me to focus on its new target. The relief was overwhelming and nauseating at the same time. I was free, but my freedom had cost my cousin her life. The thing had moved on to easier prey, someone who hadn't yet learned to resist its call. My grandmother made a decision that surprised me. Instead of maintaining the silence she'd kept for over 50 years, she picked up the phone and called Sarah's parents. Then she called the police. Then she called anyone who would listen and told them exactly where to look for the missing girl. Not in the forests around Sarah's neighborhood, not in the abandoned buildings or creek beds the search parties were combing through. In Miller's Pond, 20 miles away, in water so dark and deep that conventional diving equipment wouldn't reach the bottom. Nobody believed her at first. Why would an 8-year-old girl travel 20 miles to drown in a pond she'd never seen? How could she have gotten there without a car, without help, without anyone noticing her absence until morning? The logistics made no sense to rational minds, but my grandmother was past caring about rational explanations. She'd kept her silence once before and watched it accomplish nothing except prolonging the creature's reign of terror. This time, she was determined to break the cycle, even if it meant admitting her own complicity in decades of disappearances. The search teams reached Miller's Pond on the 3rd day after Sarah vanished. Professional divers equipped with underwater lights and cameras descended into those black depths while I watched from the tree line, hidden behind the same dead oak where I'd first cast my fishing line. They found her within an hour. Sarah was sitting peacefully at the bottom of the pond, 20 feet down, her blonde hair floating around her face like a halo. Her eyes were open but vacant, staring up at the surface with an expression of perfect contentment. She showed no signs of struggle, no indication that she'd fought against drowning. But she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was breathing underwater. The divers' cameras captured her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, as if the dark water had become her natural element. When they tried to approach her, she simply smiled and swam deeper, moving with a grace that no 8-year-old should possess. The rescue became a standoff. Every attempt to bring Sarah to the surface was met with resistance, not from her but from the water itself. Her endings that shouldn't exist pushed the divers away. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. One diver swore he saw massive shapes moving in the depths below Sarah, circling her like protective guardians. After 6 hours of failed rescue attempts, Sarah finally swam to the surface on her own. She emerged from the pond as casually as if she'd been taking a bath, water streaming from her clothes and hair, but somehow never making her cold or uncomfortable. The assembled crowd of family members and emergency personnel stared in stunned silence as she walked onto the muddy shore. But when Sarah opened her mouth to speak, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was Emma's voice, preserved exactly as it had been 70 years ago, sweet and young and utterly unafraid. She looked directly at my grandmother and smiled with recognition that spanned decades. Then she spoke words that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives, words that confirmed what my grandmother had known all along, but never dared to voice that was 30 years ago. Sarah returned home that day, but she was never quite the same. She grew up normal enough on the surface, graduated high school, went to college, started a career. But there were always moments when something else would look out through her eyes, something ancient and patient that remembered depths no human should survive. My grandmother passed away 5 years later, taking with her the weight of decades of silence and guilt. But before she died, she made me promise something. She made me swear that I would tell this story, that I would break the cycle of secrecy that had allowed the thing in Miller's Pond to hunt undisturbed for generations. So here I am, keeping that promise. Miller's Pond is still there. The signs are still posted around its perimeter, though they're faded now and barely legible. The local authorities still warn people away from the area, though most have forgotten why. And children still disappear sometimes, drawn by dreams they can't explain toward water that calls to them in voices older than memory. But now you know. Now you understand what lives in the dark places of the world, patient and hungry, and always watching for the next curious child who wanders too close to waters that were never meant for human eyes. Some secrets are kept to protect the innocent, others are kept to protect the guilty. But this secret I'm breaking because the truth, no matter how terrible, is the only weapon we have against things that feast on silence and thrive in shadows. If you ever find yourself near a pond that feels too still, too quiet, too wrong, remember this story. Remember Emma and Sarah and all the others whose names I'll never know. And whatever you do, don't cast your line into those dark waters. Some things that live beneath the surface are better left undisturbed.